Joining us now for more on the war in West Asia and what are we likely to see happen from the perspective of the United States in particular, we have John Finer, who's a former deputy NSA and a co-host of the Long Game podcast. Thank you so much, John, for speaking to Times Now. Now, a few days ago, you said that at this point, a U.S. win is going to be pretty elusive, but Trump says that we're winning the war by a lot. We've decimated the whole evil empire and it'll continue. Considering that this conflict that began on the 28th of February as a so-called preemptive strike, and we're now on the 9th day of the war, how do you assess the current stage of this conflict? Are we already past the point where limited military objectives were achievable?
So I think the United States and Israel are having significant military success against Iran. They have taken out a lot of Iran's capabilities. There have been reports that what they are briefing to Congress is that they have eliminated about 50% of Iran's missiles and launchers and drones. But that means that half of Iran's capabilities are still in place. And I think the other side of the equation is that in terms of political objectives, actually getting the regime to capitulate or producing regime change has been elusive for the United States and Israel. The Iranian regime has proven more resilient, I think, than was expected. So military success, but only limited success in terms of political objectives.
But one of the concerns that you have warned about is the sunk cost fallacy in wars where countries keep escalating because they've already invested too much. Do you see signs that policymakers in Washington, D.C. are following into that trap as far as the current conflict is concerned?
So I think that is always a risk, and it's part of the challenge associated with not being very clear up front about your objectives. When the administration was asked early in the conflict or even before the conflict, what are you actually trying to accomplish in Iran? The answers varied widely from reducing Iran's capabilities to punishing Iran for its crackdown against civilians, to trying to change the entire Iranian regime. And when you're not clear about your capabilities, it becomes very hard to determine when you can stop. And I think that is a bit of the risk of the situation for the United States and Israel right now. The other risk is that the U.S. and Israel may have different objectives. Israel's may be more maximalist than the United States, although with the lack of clarity from the United States, it's really hard to tell.
Now, initially, the war began as a confrontation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza, but it gradually expanded into Iran-Israel's direct confrontation and now appears to involve the United States as well. And U.S. is clearly, of course, invading Iran. From a strategic perspective, how did this conflict evolve into such a multi-layered confrontation?
Well, I mean, I think one of the concerns when October 7th happened and when the war began after that in Gaza is that it was going to expand regionally, in large part, frankly, because of Iran. Iran is supportive of regional proxies all over the Middle East, including Hamas, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, including the Houthis in Yemen, all of whom, to various degrees, entered the war after October 7th. Obviously, Hamas on October 7th, but Hezbollah and the Houthis after that, which always meant there was a significant risk that the conflict would regionalize. Iran, by the way, also attacked Israel twice in 2024 during the Biden administration, and the U.S. and Israel were able to defend against those attacks, although did not take significant offensive action against Iran. Israel did do some strikes, and now here we are with the war having spread directly into Iran as well as into countries in the Gulf. And there are even reports this morning, although not confirmed yet, that at least one Gulf country, the UAE, has entered the conflict by attacking Iran. Now, we'll see whether that report turns out to be true, but that would be a significant escalation.
Right. Also, we saw U.S. striking a desalination plant in Iran's Keshem Island, cutting water to 30 villages. Iran's FM has said that the U.S. set this precedent, not Iran. After that, an Iranian drone attack has caused material damage to a water desalination plant in Bahrain. The country's Interior Ministry has confirmed this. How do you see this development?
So this is another significant escalation because, in conflicts, the parties to the conflict are not supposed to, under international law, attack targets that are predominantly civilian in nature, like civilian infrastructure. And in this conflict now, there are already significant attacks in both directions against civilian infrastructure. The Iranians have been hitting hotels and the like in the Gulf. The United States and Israel have been attacking energy infrastructure now, storage, and possibly even refineries in Iran. And then, yes, there are the reports of a desalination plant in Iran being hit, and now Iran also striking desalination facilities in the Gulf. And, you have a lot of people, civilians, not fighters, who rely on these desalination plants for drinking water. And so this is an expansion of the conflict that is likely to cause additional civilian harm if it continues.
All right. After initially voicing support for Kurdish groups entering the war against Iran, Donald Trump has now said that he does not want the Kurds involved. Do you see this as a U-turn?
Well, I don't know if it's a U-turn. I'm not sure there was a decision made on this at all, but this is yet another potential avenue for escalation in this conflict, which is the entrance to Iran of factions like Iranian Kurds who are located outside Iran right now in places like Iraq, being armed, being funded to go in and fight the regime. And, I think the United States has debated this question. I think Israel probably has fewer qualms about supporting these particular factions to go and fight the Iranian regime, and we'll see what happens. But this is yet another way in which the conflict could expand and escalate in the days ahead.
Now, you've stated that you can't point to a successful example of regime change by air, given that the current military strategy is relying largely on airstrikes. Realistically, have there been any chances of achieving the regime change in Tehran going by this? And if air power alone cannot deliver that outcome, does it mean that the only way that this can be pursued is through boots on ground?
Well, I mean, just because something's never happened before doesn't mean it can't happen, but it does suggest that doing regime change solely from the air is going to be challenging. By the way, there are now reports in Washington and Israel that the insertion of special forces onto the ground in Iran by either the U.S. or Israel or both is under consideration. The missions that are described are perhaps going and trying to seize the highly enriched uranium supply that Iran still retains, or potentially even seizing energy infrastructure in a place like Kog Island, where Iran maintains significant energy facilities. Whether this happens or not, I don't know. Obviously, it doesn't seem like there has been a decision made to do that, but that would significantly alter the current trajectory of the conflict, because there are not forces on the ground fighting today. And if there are, that raises the risk on the side of the U.S. and Israel, but it also potentially increases their ability to achieve some of the objectives that they've set.
Now, you've mentioned that the U.S. may have had a win of sorts if the president had stopped very quickly after the initial salvos. Was there a miscalculation by the U.S. or Israel regarding how Iran would respond?
Yeah, I don't see any indication that this conflict is going to stop anytime soon. And again, this goes to the question we talked about earlier. If the U.S.'s only objective or primary objective was simply to remove the supreme leader and reduce substantially Iran's military capabilities, they could have stopped at an earlier stage, declared victory, and moved on. Obviously, they are trying to do something more expansive than just that. But because we don't know exactly what their objectives are, it is hard to know when this will stop. And every indication we're seeing based on what's happening in the war, based on what members of the U.S. administration are briefing Congress and saying publicly, is that this could go on for at least a few more weeks.
Now, the sinking of Iranian warship Iris Dana near Sri Lanka has suggested that the conflict is expanding beyond the traditional Middle Eastern theater. From a geopolitical perspective, was this an escalation in India's strategic neighborhood, and what message does it send about how far this war could spread?
Well, look, I don't think this necessarily indicates that the war is going to expand beyond the Middle Eastern theater. I think that was related to the fact that there was this one Iranian stray warship that had been involved in exercises in South Asia that was then heading back to Iran. I know that was highly unsettling for Indian officials, probably for the Indian population, to see that warship sunk so close to India's own territorial waters and economic zone and in its own neighborhood. But I don't think that that's an indication that you're going to see more of that. I think most of Iran's navy, if not all of Iran's navy, is now in the vicinity around Iran. Much of it has been sunk already at this point.
After the incident took place near Sri Lanka, there are two more Iranian ships, Navy ships, that are reportedly docked in Kochi in India and Sri Lanka as well, with permission despite the tensions. Do you see India's response as a calculated act of diplomatic restraint?
I think India has been very careful up till now in terms of its public messaging. It has not, as you know, condemned the conflict. It has expressed concern about escalation and call for de-escalation, but it has focused its messaging, and I think understandably so, on the plight of Indians who live in the Gulf region and who are now at risk. I think there's somewhere between 8 and 10 million Indians in that situation, and I think for any government that should be the first area of concern. Your own people and your own population. But beyond that, India's response, at least publicly, has been, I would say, fairly restrained, not particularly taking sides in this conflict.
Now, while many countries have supported the attack, but, on UK, we've seen President Trump come out to say that the UK, our once great ally, maybe the greatest of them all, is finally giving serious thought to sending two aircraft carriers to the Middle East. That's okay, Prime Minister Starmer, we don't need them any longer, but we will remember we don't need people that join wars after we've already won. What kind of message does this send about fractures within Western alliances themselves during wartime?
Yeah, so I think the position on this war for U.S. allies in Europe has also been complicated. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, it was a highly divisive moment in the transatlantic alliance. Some countries, the UK in particular, not only came out in support of what the U.S. was doing, but actually joined the U.S. in that conflict. Other countries, France in particular, said they were opposed to the invasion of Iraq. And so it had this kind of polarizing effect. In this conflict, most countries have expressed very few thoughts. They have tried to kind of stay out of either criticizing or supporting the U.S. conflict. Some countries, Germany initially, the UK, Canada even, have expressed support for what President Trump is trying to do, although you get the sense that maybe they're just trying to avoid yet another fight with the Trump administration. And I think over time, as this drags on, there is going to be increasing pressure for the European countries to be concerned about what is happening and to call for the war to stop, but we haven't seen that point yet.
Now, you've acknowledged that India and U.S. trust has suffered a setback last year, at a time when global crises from energy routes like the Strait of Hormuz to Indo-Pacific security arise and require close cooperation. Have we seen the contradictions in the relationship, which include the 50% tariffs on India for purchasing Russian oil last year to now permitting India to a 30-day waiver to buy stranded Russian oil as the war disrupts energy markets? India, in any case, never fully stopped buying oil from Russia despite American pressure. So how do you see this episode?
Well, I mean, I do think, as you say, this is a time when the United States, in a normal administration, would be calling on for the help and support of partners and allies around the world. This administration has taken a different approach to partnerships and alliances, been as tough in terms of trade negotiations on its friends as it has on its adversaries, sometimes tougher, and India is a good example of this. So while the trade dispute was resolved early this year, the underlying mistrust that was caused by months and months and months of fighting about these issues remains. And one of the things that the United States and India were fighting over was Indian purchases of Russian oil. Now the U.S. is sending this somewhat conflicting message of, well, if Russian oil is already at sea, even if it's sanctioned, that oil should be purchased so it can go into Indian and other refineries. Which I think India is likely to do, but you can understand why Indian officials might feel a bit whiplashed by these messages, one last year and one this year, that is so much in tension.
Now, you've also said that it's possible that Iran may have received help from some of its friends, potentially including China. From intelligence sharing to economic support, what role are Russia and China actually playing in sustaining Iran's ability to resist the pressure of U.S. and Israel?
Well, we don't know what we don't know, and I have no particular information that either Russia or China are helping from an intelligence perspective, although there have been some reports that suggest that, and it would make sense that they might do that if they could avoid the United States finding out about it. But taking a step back from just intelligence, what is clear is that neither Russia nor China are going to insert themselves militarily into this conflict. They're not going to come to Iran's help, as they did not come to Iran's help previously when it was attacked, as they did not come to Venezuela's help when the United States went in and seized Maduro. So their strategy is different. They will provide some diplomatic support. They may at some point provide additional economic support for Iran, although hard to do that in the current moment. They may be providing intelligence support for all we know, but they are not going to treat Iran like an ally to whom they are going to render military support. That seems very clear.
All right, John Finer, I'd like to thank you so much for taking the time out and speaking to us here at Times Now.